So it's my pleasure to welcome you all here for the Sustainability Denver Loretto afternoon. And it's my pleasure to introduce my friend Karen Kudebeh, who is right here and will start us off. She's a student of Thomas Berry, Miriam McGillis, and Brian Swim. She studied with them for many, many years. She has an intriguing way of putting it all together, which she'll share with us. And we're working together on the Sisters of Earth 2020 gathering that will happen next summer in Ferguson, Missouri. And Loretto Earth Network helped fund both Karen and me to travel to Ferguson in May so that we could have a face-to-face planning meeting. So she asked me what she could do to say thank you to Loretto, and this is what came of it. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much for your welcoming and for your support as well for the Sisters of Earth Conference, which, as some of you know, is sort of a legacy of Thomas Berry's, the people who really fell in love with what he was speaking of in terms of the universe and in terms of belonging and weaving in Western science into the religious traditions. That is what Sisters of Earth has been carrying forward for about 27 years. And so it is my pleasure to both be with you and also to be working with the Sisters of Earth in preparation for the conference that's going to be held in Ferguson next summer. Hopefully some of you will actually be able to attend that as well. As Libby said, it is both Thomas Berry, but also Sister Miriam Therese McGillis, who was my introduction to Thomas Berry about 30-some years ago, and then subsequently Brian Swim, who probably many of you have seen his Journey of the Universe, probably have seen more even prior to that. There was the whole series on the powers of the universe, very, very powerful, scientifically based, but very spiritually infused presentations. So I always find both Miriam and Brian to be sort of my access to Thomas Berry, because quite frankly, his work was very dense, and they make it much more accessible to the rest of us. So I know that today's topic is sustainability, but it's against the backdrop of a withering planet, and that's Brian's term. It's a withering planet. And so one of the first things that comes to mind for me is to ask the question, who is throwing the babies into the river that we see floating down, that we are jumping in trying to save? And indeed, they do need to be saved, right? But there's something upstream that is causing us to even have to do this. So there's some reason why we have this overconsumption and violation of Earth's processes. And this goes way back to our whole Western tradition, wherein we see ourselves as separate from the rest of Earth's life and life systems. Somehow we feel that we are outside of that, and that the divine, the spirit, and so on is not really here in the material world, but rather outside of the material world. And of course, when we see it that way, there's all kinds of reasons then to be treating the material world as if it's just stuff. And so that's the basis upon which we then are over-consuming and not asking the kinds of questions that need to be asked in order for us to be embedded with all the rest of life and respectful of the systems of life. In addition to that, we of course have a predatory economic system wherein the idea that we are somehow not enough is then put in the context of you can become enough, you can belong if you consume enough. So if you have enough travel plans, if you have more than one car, and just all of the kinds of things, the consumer goods, somehow equating our worthiness with how much we own, who we know, and so on. And so we've really set the stage then for the need to even be asking the questions that we're asking today. But as Brian says, the universe did not labor for 13.8 billion years to make us consumers. Surely there is some higher calling that we have. Fortunately, we do have access now to a new story. And it's an interesting story because it's been discovered by Western science, but it's actually been a story carried by indigenous peoples for thousands and thousands of years. And that includes living in an emergent universe, which is continually unfolding, is continually in motion. Everything is in process. When you start to look at some of the languages that indigenous peoples use, most of them hardly ever use nouns. They use a lot of verbs because everything is in process. Everything is moving. Very, very different from our English language, where everything belongs and where everything is related to everything else. So the Mitakuye Oyasin, the Lakota statement that we are all related, is one that many of us have heard, and it's certainly one that is supported by this new story, and indeed by Western science now. So, what I'm going to do today is to identify two topics that I'm convinced keep us locked into the mindset that we are somehow separate. And that keeps us from experiencing that sense of emergence and that sense of belonging. So these topics happen to be time and place. Now, it's said that Westerners are absolutely obsessed by time and that indigenous peoples are absolutely obsessed by place. So I want to see what happens when we address both time and place from the perspective of being in the center. I'm going to start with our 13.8 billion year story. We belong to the universe, and I'm going to have your attention placed on the outside of the spiral, wherein the great flaring forth, or some people would call it the Big Bang, occurred about 13.8 billion years ago. And then the subsequent events that eventually gave rise to our Earth emerging about 5 billion years ago, 4.6 billion years ago. And of course, that included the formation of galaxies and of stars. And then about 5 billion years ago, we had a supernova occur right in our area of the Milky Way galaxy. And it then created the heavy elements such that it could support a rocky planet, actually several rocky planets, going around our sun. So to think about Earth emerging out of that 13.8 billion year story, it's important to remember that it didn't always look like that from space. Instead, if you were to take pictures of the planet starting 4.6 billion years ago, starting in the outside where it's all red, that's when it was molten, then it developed a crust, and then you had iron dissolved in the oceans, that's that green color, and eventually you get to the white, and that's when we became snowball Earth. We actually froze over, sometimes to a depth of 1 mile of ice in the oceans, and that lasted for anywhere from, 50 to 100 million years are the figures that I've seen. And then that little tiny white line in the center, again, that being the present moment, that represents all of the glaciations that we call our ice ages. And those only started about 2.5 million years ago. But that's the context in which our ice ages emerged. And then if you look at the last 550 million years or so of complex life, the stories of the tectonic plate movement and of life emerging and all of those stories, it's astounding to think of what it took for the beings that are alive today to actually be here, especially when you consider some of the major extinction events that have occurred. I mean, just taking the Permian extinction, for example, about 250 million years ago, that wiped out 90% of all life. But within a very short period of time, the 10% that did remain ended up diversifying, complexifying, and again, filling the niches that had been left behind from those extinction events. Those extinctions have happened over and over again. And as some of you know, we are now in the middle of the 6th major extinction caused by us. So we are in the middle of that story. And then if we want to see where what we call our history fits into all of this, our 5,000 years of history, starting from about 3000 BCE with the major civilizations that we all learned about in school. If you take that 5,000 years and you start applying the powers of 10, you can see that there's a little tail there that talks about 50,000 years. Well, what happened during that? Well, the migrations out of Africa were included in some of that time frame. If you go to the next power of 10, 500,000 years, then 5 million, 50 million, 500 million. What we talk about as our history is only 1/1,000,000th of Earth's story. To think of what it has taken for us to be able to be sitting here today can be awe-inspiring. And then if you consider that most of us, when we do our family trees, we only consider maybe from about 1650 up to today. I mean, let's face it, that's also contained the Industrial Revolution. During that same time frame, our human population has increased 15-fold just in that little period of time. And we wonder why we are now asking the questions about sustainability in a withering planet. And so what I want to do next is to illustrate what it means to have our ancestors placed against this backdrop. So consider yourself always in the center. That's always the present moment. And you are the red dot. And in this particular view, you are surrounded by your ancestors. So your 2 parents and your 4 grandparents and your 8 great-grandparents and your 16 great-great and your 32 great-great-great, and your 64, and your 128, your 256, 512, and so on, right? Just 12 generations back, right around the time of the 1600s, each one of you has had more than 8,000 direct ancestors responsible for you being here today. So if any one of those little dots, any one of those lives hadn't occurred against the backdrop of world history in the last 350 years, you could not be here in this form. So when the indigenous peoples speak of being surrounded by the ancestors, there's a visual that we can actually apply for something like that. Similarly, if we think about ourselves as being in the center of time, then you can also consider that those dots represent future generations that will look back on us, whether biologically or otherwise, will look back on these times, and they will consider us the ancestors that created the kinds of conditions that they are then exposed to when they come onto this planet or into this planet. So I like to think about us being both the standing on the shoulders of the ancestors, as well as being absolutely critical for the children of the future. And if you consider, is sometimes talked about as that blue circle as being a nice cool pool of water, and you yourself as that little red dot, you know, that little stone that's being dropped into the center. Every time you push send on an email, or you think about something and then you act on it, or you think about something and you don't act on it, everything we do in the present moment ends up rippling out and impacting the people around us, and not just the people, but all the other beings around us. So it's critical to be thinking about the present moment as the juncture between the past and the future, and of course the present moment is all we ever really have in which to act. However, we have a problem with the way we visualize time as a line. Because when we visualize time as a line, we picture the past going into the present, going out into the future. And I'm calling it the old view. because we tend to focus on the future, but we tend to disconnect from the past. And actually, when we disconnect from the past, we tend to forget about some of the things that maybe we should be taking into account. We want to leave it all behind us. We don't necessarily want to be held accountable to some things. But then we also tend to glorify the good old days. So it's a kind of a schizoid perspective that we have on the past. But in addition to that, because we think of ourselves as going from the past into the future, we also then tend to entrench in a particular mode of thinking that keeps us away from possibilities for the future, because it's the way it's always been done from the past. And so rather than opening to other possibilities, we actually kind of just keep on the track. And speaking of tracks, I like to think about this as being in a runaway train. And here's this locomotive going from the past into the future, and what has happened to the present moment, right? The only moment that we ever have to act in is now. It's completely obliterated. Like, you can't take a deep breath and just come back to present because you're so busy going on to the next thing, this hurry sickness that our culture is so well known for. But what it does is it vacates the richness of the present moment, which is the one that we have to act in. So, that's my problem with the linear view of time. So what happens when you consider that now could be the very center of time, fed by both the past and by the future? Just taking a look at this visual here, you can see where the past can become the groundedness, the ground of your being, feeding you, allowing you to stand here with all of the gratitude, all of the acknowledgement that this is what it took for us to be here. And then standing in the center, you can imagine the future and just think of possibilities that you can become inspired by and draw that into the present moment. Again, the only moment we ever have. So if you're being fed by both the past and by the future, there are certain attributes that can happen with that being fed energetically. You are energized. You become motivated. If you actually imagine something that's exciting, you become motivated then to act in the present moment. Grateful for everything that has happened. Doesn't mean we don't have regrets, but it means that, wow, we are here now, and it took all of that for us to be here now. Emergent. It's not just a matter of emergent, like my life is this new emergence, but actually every moment is a new emergence. Every breath we take is a new emergence. Connected, clearly connected to the past, connected to the future. Informed, actually starting to ask the questions, wow, what lessons have we learned that might be applying to today, rather than just focusing on forget all of that and let's move forward. One of the images, when you think about a line, if you think about 100 years ago going behind me, as I'm focusing going forward, 100 years ago is a really, really long time if you think about it as a line. But if you become wrapped up in the story, it's surrounding you at all times. It becomes ever present. And that is the perspective that you will hear any indigenous person speaking about. When they go out on the land, they said the land remembers. It's as if it happened yesterday. You don't leave it behind. And certainly you can feel empowered by this perspective. So, if that's what you can get by inhabiting the center of time, what happens if we inhabit the center of place? Okay, here's Earth from space. We're all very familiar with it. Many of us have had spiritual experiences while meditating on this photograph. I know that a lot of the environmental movements were birthed at around the time that we could see Earth from space. That was my work that I did for many years, was in the environmental policy world. I have deep gratitude for this perspective of Earth from space. However, it still places us in the role as the observer, looking at Earth. I want to give you an alternative perspective. An artist by the name of Pablo Carlos Budassi from, I believe it's South America, put this up as part of the Wiki Commons several years ago, wherein he showed, well, I should back up. He went to Princeton University and asked for all of the NASA data that they had available in their computers for all of the whole known universe. I'm only showing you a slice of it with that, but this is the actual picture that you will see all over the internet. Here, I'll put it right here. So you can see that our sun and Earth is in the center of the entire known universe. And what is on the outside of this is the radiation that was left over from the Big Bang. Now, he uses logarithmic, he does this whole thing logarithmically so that he could fit it all in here. But what happens to people when they see this picture of us being in the center of the universe is quite astounding. Now, I want to back up and say, it has become clear, the physicists all agree, that there is no place in the universe that is any more a center than any other place, i.e. we live in an omni-centered universe. So just thinking about that for a minute, it's like, wow, so that means that I'm also a center of the universe. And when you begin to think about yourself as a center, as opposed to being on the outside looking in, not belonging to, all of that, there's something that happens in terms of agency, in terms of taking action. Brian talks about how there is nothing that happens in the entire universe except from centers. Think about that. Think about that. So, there were some very interesting things going on the internet when this picture came out. That people were going, wait a minute. This doesn't accord with anything that I've been taught, but it happens to be true from scientific perspective. Okay, so let's now do something a little bit more familiar with us, and that is to take a look at where we live here in Colorado. So again, we're looking at a map, that's something that we commonly do. And now I want us to imagine ourselves as being inside, sorry about that, there we go, as being inside that little green dot in the center, being inside 6 directions. The 4 cardinal directions, as well as the above, the zenith, the nadir, being contained in that center of everything that goes around us. So what I want to do is to have everyone raise your hand. We're going to do a little test here to see whether we feel comfortable being in the center of place. So I want everybody to raise your hand, okay? And on the count of 3, let's have everybody point to the direction north. 1, 2, 3. Point and hold it. Point and hold it. Okay, we got different directions going on here. Okay. Most of you seem to think that's the direction of north. I suspect it probably is. Let me tell you that when I've done this, thank you. Because now that you know the direction of north, that means you know the direction of south, right? And you know the direction of west. And those of us who live on the Front Range of Colorado are very blessed because we know where the mountains are. They're always west. Well, unless you live, Central City or something, right? So we tend to have a much better sense of where we are than people in Philadelphia. I remember one time I tried it in Philadelphia, and of course it was all over the board, where the directions were. So once we get a sense of centeredness, I want to start talking about the stories that embrace us while we are in the center. Because the universe has imprinted itself on this landscape. So now we're going to be bringing in the story of the universe as well as our own stories, our own history stories. We're going to sample from a few time frames here, just to get a sense of what it feels like to be in the center of place. But in order to do this, we're going to have a blank slide, because when we tell stories and we have everybody looking in one direction, we're still not getting that we're in the center of place. So what I'm going to do is just suggest a few stories from each of the directions, just to get a sense of different time frames, but being here now. Okay. I'll start with north. And about 1.7 billion years ago, the edge of the North American continent was about the Wyoming border. And then when the continent moved and started adding all kinds of land, volcanic arcs and so on onto it, making Colorado, it still retained a lot of those deep fissures that went deep into the body of our planet, such that much later we had explosions of magma coming up right around the Wyoming border, and actually, because they were going so deep down, they were accessing the places where diamonds are formed. And because they were so deep, they shot up. Those magma infused fissures now were shooting up at about 200 miles an hour by the time they hit the surface of the Wyoming-Colorado border. And it meant that the carbon didn't switch from the usual way, which is to go from diamond into graphite, so that by the time it hits, here, it's more graphite. Instead, it retained its diamond form. And so we have kimberlite mines, diamond mines, right here in Colorado. And most people have no idea that they exist outside of South Africa. But by golly, they do exist here too, and a few other places on the planet. But those were the conditions under which we were able to get diamonds actually lying on the surface of the ground up there. Okay, next I'm going to go east. And since all of you live in Colorado, you're very familiar with pronghorn and these herds of pronghorn. And they go really fast. They can go 60 miles an hour and actually keep going for 60 miles an hour for quite some time. And of course, the question for those of us who ask, well, how did that come to be, is, well, how is it that pronghorn is so fast? There's no predator around that can go anywhere near that fast. But 12,000 years ago, if you were looking on the high plains here, you would have seen pronghorn chased by cheetah. Cheetah was right here in North America. It disappeared about 12,000 years ago. It's a different form than the cheetahs that you find elsewhere on the planet. But it was a very fast runner, and that's what we can thank for having very fast pronghorn today. Okay, east. Southeast. I want to bring to mind more recent history, and that is the site of the Sand Creek Massacre. This occurred over 150 years ago. It's about 1864. When we start to consider place, and you begin to see names of place names here locally, like Little Raven, downtown Little Raven. Little Raven was the Arapaho chief that was trying his best to negotiate some kind of an agreement between the white settlers and the Arapaho, and he kept attempting that, and it turned out that he ended up being at the Sand Creek Massacre site after it happened. He was actually with a small band of warriors that were a small distance away, but when he came back, he realized that he was dealing with people that were very, very different in terms of the thinking, very different in terms of what it meant to be true to your word. I mean, just all kinds of things, just very different clashes of all kinds occurred that day at the Sand Creek Massacre site. But it's just an example of what we see in so many other places, but it happens to be Colorado's example. A few years ago, I was able to take part in some of the healing ceremonies and speeches that took place here down at our state capitol, there were people, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho and other Native peoples came in and beat the drums and did the chanting, and we issued an official apology to some of the Native peoples, and so some of the healing certainly has begun. There's a Sand Creek Massacre run that happens each year as well. But yeah, we cannot forget some of the more recent history that we are also surrounded by. Then to the south, we think about Pikes Peak. Now we're going to go the opposite direction. Pikes Peak itself is this huge protrusion, I guess, of granite that is over 14,000 feet high, that actually formed many miles below the surface of the Earth, and then through all kinds of tectonic plate movement and so on, finally emerges today, over 1 billion years old. So that's one of the sites to keep in mind as we go to the south. If you think about the southwest, the Collegiate Range, about 38 million years ago, there was a huge explosion. Mount Antero, that whole area completely exploded. And the Castle Rock rhyolite, or Wall Mountain tuff, that is this amazing construction material that I know our church, the Montview Boulevard Presbyterian Church, is made of, as well as the Molly Brown House here locally. That is what encased the whole Front Range about 38 million years ago. So that's where that happened. To the west, you've got the Great Laramide Orogeny. You've got the mountain building that occurred, lifting up all those layers and layers and layers of sediment that we now see as Red Rocks Amphitheater, as Dinosaur Ridge. You know, all of the stories that we have from the last 300 million years ago are lifted up because of the Laramide Orogeny from about 70 million years ago. Finally, to the northwest, I'm just going to acknowledge something that brought me to Colorado. Back in 1970, my boyfriend and I at the time were deciding where we were going to move to after being at Washington State University. And I knew I'd be going to grad school somewhere. And so we went to back in those days, the way you found out about those things, right, was to go to the alumni library. Where else were you going to go? So I happened to catch a glimpse of the Boulder Flatirons, just a glimpse of the Boulder Flatirons as you looked at the covers of all of these catalogs. And I just went, oh, they just took my breath away. And I just said, that's where we're going. And so Gene walked over to the bookcase and he said, well, let's find out what state we're moving to. And that's exactly what we did. So been here ever since. That's quite, I guess that's trusting. Yeah, trusting the rocks, by golly. That's what it is, it's trusting the rocks. Then think about the fifth direction above our head. Think of the night sky. Think of stars being our ancestors. They are. We all know that. We know that our bodies, the heavy elements in our bodies, are forged from the death throes, the supernovas, from the large stars. We and all the other material things that we see around us required the dying of those stars. So when we look at the stars, we truly can say those are our ancestors, not those particular ones, but the ones that preceded them. And then if we think about the direction beneath our feet, I mentioned before about the fountain formation, the 300 million year old sandstone that makes up the Boulder Flatirons and our own Red Rocks Amphitheater. That particular layer, because it's no longer lifted up, except right next to the Rockies, that particular layer actually lies about 2 miles under our feet right here. So that's where the fountain formation exists, under our feet. Also, in terms of that direction, think about the power of gravity to hold us to Earth, and acknowledge that it's gravity that keeps us strong. You know, when the astronauts first went out and they didn't realize that what would happen to our bodies when you were in zero gravity, well, they came back to Earth and they were not able to walk. Their muscles decomposed, their bones started demineralizing. So we can thank that direction to keep us strong. And then finally, all of those directions meet When we are each a center, they all meet right here in the human heart. And there are a lot of stories that some Indigenous peoples tell about the importance of having hidden that seventh direction, because it's the most powerful direction of all, needing to hide it in a place where it would be safe. And when it was time to be discovered, it could be discovered. But think about that seventh direction is the power of love. The seventh direction is always seen as the power of love. So when we think about that connection, that we carry that power, that direction within us, no matter where it is that we go, that is always the center that we carry with us. So that, in many ways, bridges over into what our own traditions teach us about the power of love. This is the conclusion that I've come to, and I'll just read it with you. Centering in time and place by means of visuals and stories can help break the illusion of separation and reconfirm that we belong. So I want to thank you so much for your attention and for your support.
What I thought would be helpful was if Denver sits with Denver and the suburbs west of Denver sit together. The center table where I see Gene East is labeled for just the larger metro area, so it could include anyone. But the reason it's important is as we're talking about these items of trash, the different jurisdictions have different ways of handling that. So you don't need to move, it's just that that's what my presentation might be leading to. We have large sheets of white paper, and you have little sticky notes. So the pink color, if you could write questions on things that you might want me to research, that would be helpful, and stick them on your jurisdiction. This is Denver, that's west of Denver, and Metro just fell off the wall. And thank you, Jason. I've meant to introduce Jason Bosch, who's kindly helping with the video so that the rest of Loretto and the rest of Denver, in fact, who's not here, can just see how we're presenting on sustainability today. The other colors of sticky notes, if you have brilliant ideas, please write them down and put them on the sticky notes. And the overarching question that I'd like us to be thinking about is, how can Loretto act together? Here, the Denver Loretto community. How can we act together? How could we possibly focus on a next step? We're in the center of our history with potential to act intentionally for the future. We're in the center of a place and connected to all beings. How will we address the question of sustainability at the point that Jessie left us in her presentation in May at the Motherhouse? So I think this is going to move through automatically, so I will just be done in 10 minutes, whether I've thought of everything I plan to say or not. We hope it works. So, community, diversity, and interiority are three major themes of the universe, and I'm going to address our tasks in that context, and then acting from the center of the spiral. And I don't remember what else I was going to say about that. So here we are. I like Thich Nhat Hanh's word for communion, which is interbeing. We are connected with all sentient and non-sentient beings, including humans. we are home here and connected, and we don't have to keep accumulating stuff. We can let go of our shopping addiction and even our need for retail therapy, because we can find companionship in nature and with neighbors. And at my time of life, what I think of is friends who downsize together, stay together. Hence the samples of discards at your tables that will be part of our work together today. So let me talk about diversity. And diversity, one of the three major themes of the universe, diversity of all beings. Only the diversity that makes us rich. And in terms of what we're talking about today, where Jessie left us off with, how do we deal with our waste? Our kitchen waste is a very big factor that we need to keep out of the landfill. So we want compost, and that is what feeds the diversity of the livestock beneath the ground. Those critters, if you read the Loretto Earth Network news in the spring, very, very important that they have the nourishment that they need to feed the food that we want to come from the ground. It's also very important for sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. In Denver, we have curbside composting that Denver City provides for a small fee. And outside of Denver, you can sign up as well. And it's very convenient that even if you're a meat eater, you can put meat, you can put dairy, you can put bones, as well as your yard waste. Apartments also have access to services that will pick up your compost. And I have two of them here. I have handouts. You don't need to write notes for yourself. All these websites are on a handout that I will provide at the end of this. In your apartment or in your home, you can actually enlist the services of worms to compost. And we have an expert here, my son Ryan, who knows how to do this and who does it all the time. If you have any questions about vermiculture, contact Ryan. And the main purpose of all of this diversity that we're creating with the compost is to put it in the soil. I love that, the care with which that, the care that evokes. And this is just one of the local gardens that will accept your compost if you don't have your own garden. The next theme I want to mention from the three themes of the universe is interiority. Thomas Berry considered Earth as a spiritual presence. Not that we feel spiritual when we're in nature, but that we learned about spirituality partly from coming from Earth. And the interiority, the presence of Earth has a physical dimension, in my view. Karen talked about a lot of the geology. What I focus on a lot is oil and gas and coal. Earth has sequestered carbon over millennia. Very wise thing to do. And for us to leave it there would also be wise. But now you have the tar sands, and you have my hometown, by the way, is at the bottom. That is the plastics dimension of the ExxonMobil oil refinery in Baytown, Texas. And that little bit of water you see out there is where my rich friends used to water ski. And that's why I make it move, because you would hear a lot more from me than that. Okay, and so that internalized oil and gas and coal that has now become plastics. I don't know if you can see it, it's kind of washed out, but that's plastics on the beach with seagulls trying to feed on it. And if you're if we're sending it to some poor people to process it for us, it makes them sick. It's got all kinds of bad chemicals in it. There's even a little dog there that's suffering from it. We have heard all kinds of horrible things about what happens to the sea creatures. Plastics are just not good for the planet or the people. So we're trying to recycle it. Now China is saying you can only recycle it if you follow our rules, and they want the contamination standard to be so intense that a lot of our stateside processing centers are having trouble meeting China's standard. So it looks like we're going to have to deal with our own stuff ourselves. Wonder why? Maybe it has to come home, and we have to deal with it. So some of the processors have said if we could just get people to really follow the rules and not throw contamination like food or put plastic bags in, if we can't process the plastic bags, then we could send it to China. It's kind of hard to change our behaviors, but that's one aspect of how to handle that. There's another, there's a hard to recycle service, H2R. So those places are about town. This junk king that I ran into, well, not exactly ran into it, but they will recycle the junk. They'll just come if you're downsizing. They'll take it and they'll send it. 60% of what they take in, they say they recycle. That's much better than the 35% that Denver recycles. Plastic bags, we all know about that. I have a little bit of a reference for you just to get into the details of what to do with your plastic bags. And so this is part of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. By 2050, the oceans will contain more plastics than fish by weight if we keep on as we're going now. So here's a movement that's beginning to divest not only from fossil fuels, but from their effluent called plastics, and respect the interiority of the earth and the wisdom of millions of years of Earth's practice to sequester carbon. So now I'm just going to talk about acting from the center of the spiral, as Karen gave us such wonderful images. What will we do about some of our practical tasks, such as I've scattered on your tables? Where Jessie left it with the Motherhouse, they're going to have a trash audit in the 4th week of July. Right before you put your trash into the bin to be collected that day, weigh it. We could participate in that if we want to. And then down the road, as we get better and better, we hope to see our trash reduced. We have parish work we can talk about. Laudato Si trains, there's a training process to become an animator. There's a season of creation we can do in our parishes. And Loyola Paris is just hot shot, 8:45 in the morning on the 3rd Sunday of the month. Training indeed. Advocacy, San Francisco has set a goal of 0 waste. Their trash bins are tiny, their recycle bins are large, and their compost bins are in the middle. Trader Joe's is phasing out plastics because they're hearing from us. So we have some things we can do. This is the Assembly resolution we passed to significantly mitigate our impact on climate change and ecological degradation. So the table work that I have us, that I'm hoping we can do is to start with the small work that's right in front of us and get ourselves geared up for the large work that's ahead. That's it. So what I'd like to see is ideas that we can put up on these sheets and then figure out how to organize them together. Anna.
Is there a sort of non-creating more trash way to transmit that information you just gave us?
I have handouts. Unfortunately, I put them on paper.
Well, they can be recycled.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted you to have information, but I also wanted you to have time to talk with each other. And maybe we get something out of it in the form of something to work with on these white sheets. Or we could do something else. It's your party now.
Libby, what are we supposed to do with these, like, practice where they go?
You could, or you could just give them back to me. I washed them.
You know, this trail that I walk in Boulder, when I take my granddaughter to school, they have compostable bags for dog waste. Yeah. And so, you know, and then, you know, where you put the dog waste in, it says only, you know, compostable bags. So I've been thinking about that, and then wondering about the the manufacture of those bags, and whether it's the same thing. Is it from petroleum that they're made, or are they made like, you know, some glasses like this are made of cornstarch now, and silverware is, you know, plasticware, but it's not plastic. It's cornstarch based so that it can be compostable.
Yeah.
So I wonder what those bags are manufactured
I use
from.
those for my kitchen, 13-gallon
Compostable bags.
Yeah, made by 7th generation. I don't know what they're made of, but
I'm thinking of using those bags for food storage bags instead of the Ziploc.
Yes.
Going to store you to some of those
can you
bags.
get those?
Yeah, King Soopers has.
Do they?
They have they're called Simple Truth.
Oh, Simple Truth.
You get the 13-gallon or you get the 2.6 gallons.
Really?
So we could put pressure on other grocery stores. I mean, like natural grocers, they don't, you have to bring your own bag. They don't give any bags for you to take stuff away, but they still have plastic bags
For
too.
produce.
For produce. Right. Right, but those would be so much better.
Yeah,
You can also wash
yeah, I do that.
the Ziploc bags, which we do.
Yeah.
But
I do too.
What I've noticed though is that the Ziploc company has gotten kind of wise about this. And I'm not sure what they did, but they made it so that if you wash the bag more than once, the zipper doesn't work. So,
Really?
you know, because they want you to buy more bags.
Right.
So you're kind of fighting this.
I thought the zippers just kind of wore out. Maybe it is.
I mean, I used mine over and over,
Yeah.
and then over again.
We should do a campaign of boycotting.
But how much better it would be if we weren't using those at all. I hate to ever get a new one out. I use them to bag chili in the fall. And so then as we use the chili, then I just keep reusing the bags for everything else. And so I don't feel so bad about that. But, you know, when I'm out of those, you know, the reused chili bags, it just kills me to go and pull one out of the box. But gee, if they were compostable and not made from petroleum product, you know what I want? I want to find some younger people who would start a recycling plant. I mean, where they do the recycling. Not a gathering, but where they, you know, make whatever from the recycled products. You know, somewhere just outside of Denver. And I think that there are people who have money who would fund something like that, you know, fund that kind of a factory. And I mean, think of the people who could be employed. And I wish that I were younger because I would
There's a project
love
like
to
that
do that.
in Haiti. I heard it on the radio a few months ago. Maybe you know about it. This guy employs people to pick up trash, especially plastic stuff, and then he makes products that the people need out of the recycled plastic and teaches people about then recycling it again. And it's working very well. And is that kind of the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, in Colombia, the country of Colombia, they're making bricks out of plastic, and building houses.
Yeah.
With those bricks. I mean, I
So
just
they have machines to do that? Kind of, but
yeah, and pressurized and everything, and they're very solid and here it is, a permanent use for that plastic, so it doesn't have to be recycled again. But I just, instead of transport, now China doesn't want our recycling anyway. And I think Libby, what Libby said, wonder why that happened, but then she said maybe it's better. Maybe it's better for us to be stuck with our own junk. Mm-hmm. And maybe it is. Shipping that all the way across the world to China.
Think about everything that's being used to transportation.
Yeah, it never made any sense to me anyway. But I just think, if we, and I don't know who the we are, but if we in this area got, a plant going that was, that could deal with recycled materials. That would take off, and it would take off then. Wyoming has all kinds of open space. To start one there. There'd be all different kinds of places that could start. And I believe that there are wealthy people who would fund that kind of a thing.
along with that would need to be some effort to stop the production
Yes.
of lemonade in plastic.
Yes.
And not to get more lemonade containers for our bricks.
Yeah.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
To kind of simultaneously work at the other end.
I think that's a
I
major help.
absolutely agree. Yeah.
Yeah, for that to work, under the current business as usual model, the company who does that would have to make a business case and say, by doing this, it's more efficient, it's cheaper. But the way that the economics are structured right now, particularly with the pressure from oil and gas companies and companies that produce these products, it'd be difficult to do that. So the thing that I'm struggling with is in addressing these issues, we can each do things individually, but there's another level that where our hands are tied because of politics and policies. And so to what extent do we involve ourselves at that level?
Yeah, I
To
mean,
what extent do we what?
Involve ourselves at that level.
Oh, right.
Bernie Sanders basically says we're not going to get anywhere very far unless we really tackle big ag, big pharma, big oil, big gas, because that's where it's all going.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. So I was meeting with two young lawyers. One of them is on the Angelica Village board, and they both work in the oil and gas. They're lawyers for oil and gas. And so I said to the one that's on our board, so how do you do that and then do this other kind of social justice sort of thing? Like, how do you live with yourself, sort of like that? And, then that led to a discussion about oil and gas companies and all of that. And one of the things she said was that right now they actually, some of them are trying to create more, like they're investing in recycling. However, she said they haven't figured out how to make money on it. And they're still investing, but they put it in like their experimental unit or whatever they call it, because they can't make the money on it. Of course, they can make on oil and gas, but there are some companies who understand that they've got to move in that direction.
Wow.
And so I didn't know that, and I was interested in that. It did make me think about, geez, wouldn't it be great to somehow bridge that? I mean, to find the self-interest in their case with our self-interest.
Right.
And also the whole
And I think it's possible. I mean, I really do, because I think, I mean, you know, just like, you know, the president is grasping at straws to keep the coal industry alive. But as a matter of fact, you know, people don't want to buy coal anymore. I mean, it's still happening, but it's happening at a decreasing level, even though, you know, he's made all those changes and made it easier for the coal industry. It still isn't going.
I think also lobbying transportation systems in Denver is pitiful. The RTD system could be so much better. And I mean, as my friend Marion, who has not been driving for probably 8 or 10 years, she said the light rail system is built for people who have cars. You can't get to a light rail station easily. It's either a dangerous walk, or it's too far, or it's not set up. And all this designed to widen I-70, and I mean, it's like, does anybody talk at all about what about trains to these ski areas? At least viewable. I mean, it would be so perfect in my mind. I think here in Denver, talking to RTD, lobbying them somehow would be very helpful. I don't know if any of you have taken the bus much, but it doesn't work well.
No. Do any of you ever go to El Dorado Springs?
Sometimes I do.
Does the bus go there? Oh, or just go?
There used to be, you know, there's a big hot springs pool there, and then, you know, of course, the wonderful El Dorado Springs Park. There used to be a train that would go there. I think it went twice a day up and then twice a day back.
From Denver?
From Denver, yeah. And people would just hop on that train, you know, go up and go swimming. And then I think there was like a dance hall and whatever else. I mean, you know, I am stepping into the past and saying, oh, the good old days. But as a matter of fact, I mean, that was a reality. And I mean, we could have those realities, but I mean, it's amazing to me how the light rail that we've developed, we society has developed, is so expensive that then it makes it almost unreachable for normal people to be able to even take it. I mean, it's incredibly expensive, you know, the way they're making the light rail. And why do they have to do that?
It's expensive to take a bus. And
It
the
is.
bus I take to work, it took to work for years, lot of working people are on that bus. I happen to work at a place where we got an eco pass, so I didn't have to pay. But I saw people who I'm sure were getting minimum wage or on Social Security, putting their money in. Now the price has gone up.
Right.
And then half the time, well, that's a third of the time, the bus wouldn't come. So you'd have to wait 15 minutes for the next one. I mean, I called RTD so many times. I said, I am sure people are losing their jobs because they're not on time. And they're not on time pretty often. It's the bus, that particular bus. Oh, well, we don't have enough drivers. It was just so many.
Right.
I know 9 to 5 took on some of that work. There is a with RTD, there is a group that's doing transportation advocacy around particularly lower income populations. And several, I think the Denver Foundation helped funded and some of the organizing groups are taking it on because they're hearing those stories.
There just was a big jump.
Yeah.
A big jump in fare.
I just said to my grandkids, they were talking about getting somewhere, and I said, well, you can take the bus. And they looked at me and they said, Mama, it's cheaper to take Uber. And I said, what? I said, it is not. And they counted up the fares, and it would have been cheaper.
Many people for like 3 or 4 people.
Yeah, to take Uber.
Right.
And now that is really awful. Because then there's no motive to take public transportation because it's so expensive.
We face that with the kids, the refugee kids.
I got 2 things. Do you have things to put up?
RTD, did you put that? The refugee kids.
Should I put it about developing a factory outside of town?
Here, make a business case, add to that. They have to use public transportation when they first get here. And I think part of the reason Renata picks them up, which we end up picking them up, is because it's so hard to use public transportation.
Yes.
And now they all have their own cars.
And now they all have their own cars.
Right.
They all want, because it's so hard to get them all around. Yeah, I know. Yeah. And that's part of that come to America and get a car, I'm sure there's some of that in there. But, you look at somebody like Laura, she was going way out east to CCD, and then back downtown to her job. Yeah, it's kind of...
They did something on the news the other night that was cool about all the different places that are in the foothills so you can get to on a bus.
Oh, interesting.
Let me say what I've seen here. Well, up in the right quadrant there, I see some suggestions. On the left side, I see a challenge to whether recycling works at all. And then in the bottom, I see intersectional issues that are problematic and burning us out. In other words, the intersection with water, the intersection with whether you need more energy to make compostable bioplastics and that sort of thing.
Those are more the ones I'm familiar with, for sure. Well, go ahead. There were a couple of aspects to the intersectionality. One is we were speaking about kind of using the framework again of all of us jumping into the water trying to save the babies when actually what's going on upstream is something we have to get a handle on. So one of them has to do with what commitment from a systems standpoint is there going to be made. That's where we have to be putting our energies. Because otherwise, we end up jumping into the river, doing all of these things, getting diverted, and then getting totally burned out and cynical because we find out that the things that we've been wasting water cleaning out are actually just going into the landfill anyway because our local municipality is not telling us that they are not really able to fund their recycling programs. So, I've just seen that over and over. We are just cynical as heck, and they were going to continue to be so unless we have some kind of accountability to what's going on upstream.
Thank you very much.
We had a variety of really good ideas. one idea that we had was to develop a recycling center just outside of the Denver metro area. And when we're talking about a recycling center, we don't mean a place where you could take your recycling goods, but a place where there would be a factory that would use those, they would sort the recycled products there, but then use some of those products to build new items. An example of that is in the country of Colombia. They're using plastics to make bricks, and they use those bricks then to make houses. And so, that is one idea. And so we need young people, and Libby's son Ryan just said that he is finishing up his degree in mechanical engineering, and I think that's exactly the kind of person that we need, is a young person with that kind of background. And we also believe that there are a lot of companies that would fund that kind of thing, but then it could very shortly become self-sustaining. So that was one idea that we had.
We talked a lot about the transportation system in the Metro Denver area, how light rail is really made for people with cars because where the stations are located are not easy to get to, often in areas not easy to walk to, and how bus fares have gone up, and that we really feel like there needs to be more advocacy with the transportation system in the metro area, keeping in mind particularly people who don't have the resources that others have.
Yeah, we also talked about plastic bags and how we could do much more in terms of compostable plastic bags, and the grocery stores, which even are cutting down on plastic, are still using regular plastic bags for the produce, and also the extent of the packaging could be vastly cut down. Not before we get to having to recycle the plastics, let's have way less plastics to begin with.
And we talked about the plastic bags being available at King Soopers. Not plastic, but the compostable bags that they're available at King Soopers. And then we talked about encouraging other stores to carry those compostable plastic bags also.
Hi. So we recycled and sorted our questions into 3 different categories. Things about individual behavior, things about resources that we're interested in following up on, and organizational things. The City of Lakewood, various recycling companies that have different rules, different ways of doing it, and how sometimes confusing but important it is to know that for your current provider. And all these things sort of segue, a question about what is a carbon offset and how to use it becomes a resource then of, are you talking about a private or a commercial donation? How should that be applied? I think a big issue for us was this question about clothing, fabric. What happens when things that you don't want to donate to the thrift store or to Goodwill, where does that fabric go? What's the best use for it when it's not resaleable but should be recycled? So that was a big one that we hadn't thought of. And everyone's practice about how they handle plastic, say the peanut butter jar, how Regina washes it out versus how I wash it out is different. So just highlights the need to keep talking about it, keep researching. Is there a way to tour the city recycling plant? Questions like that.
So, thank you everyone. It's time to wrap up. The idea of Loretto Sustainability Circles was floated at the Motherhouse. So we have I have one handout. On one side it says sustainability circles, and on the other side processing consumer waste. As far as sustainability circles go, we actually have two larger than Loretto groups that might serve very well if you want to get involved in something like a sustainability circle. One is with Together Colorado. They're organizing groups, they are organizing all of the faith-based communities in Denver around the theme of care of creation. So one of the handouts is their minutes of their first organizational meeting, and on the other side of that is a sample agenda for the next care of creation meeting at Loyola Parish. I checked with Romaine, and she's fine if we want to just drop in and find out how they do the wonderful things they do. One of the items of recycling on the table was glasses, like tableware. You can't really put those in the recycling, and glass in recycling bins is a problem generally because it breaks down, it messes up the equipment. They have a bin to recycle glass only in the parking lot of Loretto Parish. That's just one of the many things they're doing. The third handout has text boxes on it, and it's from EcoCycle about Plastic-Free July. See if you can make it one day without plastics. They're trying to get us to make it a whole month without plastics. So thank you, everyone. We'll film, and I'll type up the notes, and we'll see where we go from there. I appreciate your time.